Welcome to Draw This. In this episode, we're going to draw a moon. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to be using Corel Painter 2015 and Photoshop today. We'll go ahead and start with the oval selection tool. If you hold Alt and Shift while you draw with this tool, you can get a perfect circle that draws from the center. And then you can go ahead and drag it to try to center it as best you can. Choose Select, Convert to Shape to convert it to a vector shape. And then if you click to the right of the layer in the Layers palette, you can get the shape properties. Turn off the stroke and add a fill. Next we'll create a new layer below that, and we'll go ahead and call that Space. This will be a dark background, so we'll choose black, and then we'll choose the fill command to go ahead and fill that background very quickly with that color. And then we'll select both the sphere and the space background with Shift, and then we'll center them horizontally and vertically. Now I'm going to create some new layers just for each overlapping component of the moon. I have the texture, craters, spots, highlights, and shadows. I'm going to change the composite methods appropriately for those. So anything that's dark will be multiply, and anything light will be screen. I'm going to use the airbrush to go ahead and shade within that shadow area. And then we'll add light on the opposite side. So we'll have the light coming from the right in this piece. I'm going to go ahead and merge those layers together and blend them with a large diffuse blur blender. Next I'm going to select one of the ink brushes that's called Ink Drops, and I'm going to use a dark gray color to just add in some little ink drops by tapping with my stylus pen here. This is a really interesting brush because you can add ink and subtract ink in a really organic way, so I'm just kind of going through and tapping in some little spots here. There's also a subtractive version of this brush called Graphic Bristle Resist, and that will eat away at the ink. So it gives you some really nice crater and different texture results for your moon. Next I'm going to go ahead and merge those spot layers together now, and then I'm going to choose Select Layer Content to create a selection and then create a new layer. And then I will use the Noisy Flow Map Watercolor brush under the Real Watercolors category. And I'm going to choose a paper texture that is called Bumpy Elephant Skin. And then I'm going to go ahead and just basically use a big brush to paint over that whole selection area. And then now we can delete that extra layer that's between the watercolor and the spots. And we can go ahead and return to the watercolor layer and reduce the opacity of it a little. Next we'll need to right click on the layer and convert it to a default layer. And then we can continue adding more layers of watercolor to build up the texture here on the moon. This gives you some really interesting effects. When you're finished adding texture, you can go ahead and merge all those layers down with Control E, and then I'm going to blend with the Coarse Smear Blender Jitter brush. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that layer and add a mask to the topmost layer. I'll select black, and then I'll select the Square Chalk brush. And when you paint with black on a mask, you conceal that area of that layer. So duplicating this layer made it darker, and masking removes some of that darkness in that area where we're painting with black on the mask. You can try out other papers too. The Polypay Wool Inverted works really well to add kind of a distant mountainous terrain texture. So I'm going to add a little bit of that. You can go ahead and adjust the opacity of that layer to get a more subtle blend. And then go ahead and save a copy of your artwork and then merge those two spot layers together with Control E. But if you want to make sure that you don't paint outside your surface shape, you can go ahead and choose Select Layer Content to put a selection around it and then hide that selection with Control Shift H. And then anything that you paint on new layers will stay within that circular shape. So for instance, I'm adding layers of texture with the sponge, and that's keeping it right inside of that circular shape. I'm going to add some craters with the digital airbrush. I'm adding separate layers for the light and the dark colors. That just gives me a little more flexibility and allows me to blend a little bit better. I'm going to use one of the particle brushes that I created called Hair Thick to go ahead and draw in some white craters. This is where craters impacted and maybe scattered some lighter dust around. I'm going to add some texture with an image hose brush I created called Wrinkle, and this works really well to add a variety of different sized fractal wrinkle textures. So I'm going to paint that over the whole layer, and then I might even change the composite method to something like overlay to make it blend a little better, and then add a few more layers of that texture and reduce the opacity of them as well. I'm going to choose the Relief Blobs Image Hose brush, and I'm going to add some of that on a new layer. I'm going to change the composite method to multiply to make some little craters. I'll add another layer with the composite method set to screen and add some little white bumps with that same brush. Next I'm going to add a lighten layer and use the airbrush to go ahead and lighten the moon and maybe remove some of that light on the dark side. Next I'm going to add some details on a new layer with the detail oils brush. These are going to be little bumps and rocks and craters and things, just little fine small details with a little sharp brush. You want there to be a balance of big broad shapes and fine little sharp shapes. I'm going to add more texture with the square chalk brush as I did before and maybe mask it a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and save a copy of the artwork, and then let's get a selection from the surface layer again, and then we'll go ahead and merge all of these moon layers except for the space background. And then once those layers are merged, we should still have a selection. We can invert that selection, and then we can go ahead and go to the moon layer and hit delete or clear that. That way it'll clear anything that was in the background that was overpainted. Next I'm going to save as a PSD and open this in Photoshop so that we can go ahead and bulge the center of this to make it look a little more three-dimensional. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use the pinch effect, which is up in the effects menu under distort and pinch. And pinch will basically just kind of inflate this like a balloon. Now you have to go the opposite direction with the pinch, so you have to take it into the negative, and that will do the opposite of pinch, which is bulging or bloating. You can also choose the effect for liquefy bloat. That also works really well if you use the bloat brush with a really large brush. You can kind of change it up a little bit more. Let's go ahead and save this again and jump back over to Painter again. It's nice that this PSD format is cross-compatible between the two programs. So let's go ahead and make a selection from that moon layer and create a new layer, and let's make it a multiply composite method, and let's start adding some color glazing. I'll add a little light orange cream color with the airbrush and a little bit of a light blue, and that gives it a little bit of flavor. And of course we can play with the opacity of that to make it more subtle. I'm going to add a screen layer, and I'm going to just kind of highlight some of the lighter areas a little bit to make it look a little more dusty. And let's add some more fine little details like little craters near the edges. You want to try to keep these kind of smaller and flatter than all the craters that are in the center. That'll make them look like they're curving around the corner there. That's really essential to helping this look three-dimensional instead of flat. Let's go ahead and merge those layers down, and let's create a selection from that layer and create a new layer, and let's add a little bit of darkness using the multiply composite method. We can use the airbrush and the chalk and the sponge and all kinds of different brushes to add more darkness. I'm going to add some light spots with the liquid ink brush that we used earlier with the little droplets. We'll go ahead and reduce the opacity of those so they blend in a little bit better. Add some more texture. You can see that this is a back and forth process of adding texture and blending and adding little fine details and blending more and adding more texture. There really isn't any particular order you have to do this in. You just kind of build it up until you're happy with the way it looks. I'm going to enhance a few areas here and there, like the little crater that's on the bottom right corner. And then I'm going to save as a PSD again and go back into Photoshop. And let's add some focal blurring so that the edges get blurry as the moon moves away from us in three-dimensional space. So I'm going to use the iris blur that's available in the blur gallery and basically just have it blur the edges progressively as the moon curves away. I'm going to choose high quality so that it looks a little bit better. And then we'll go ahead and enhance the contrast of this layer a little bit by duplicating the layer. You can right click on it and choose duplicate layer, and let's choose the adjustment for shadow and highlights, and we'll just kind of play with the shadows just a little bit to balance them out, but we don't want to make them too bright. Mainly we just want to play with the mid-tone contrast here and enhance it a little bit. I think that looks pretty good. You can also play with the opacity of that layer if you want to adjust it and fine-tune it a little bit. Let's just go ahead and merge those layers. I think that looks good. And then we can go ahead and save a copy of our artwork as a PSD again and bring it back into Painter so that we can keep working on it. And you can see I like to work back and forth between Painter and Photoshop because Photoshop works really good for all the little effects that Painter can't do, and Painter's much better at doing painting, so it's nice to use the right tool for the right job. I'm going to add some more color glazing on a new layer, and I'm making sure to always make sure that my paint stays within that selection by using select layer content on that main moon shape there. I'm going to go ahead and merge all the layers down again, and I'm going to duplicate that layer and set it to overlay and then blur that layer a little bit with effects focus soften, and that'll give it a nice soft focus effect. I'm going to go ahead and reduce the opacity of that layer a little bit to blend it in so it's not too dark. I think that looks pretty good. You can always do a little before and after by clicking on the eyeball there. And now the contrast is enhanced and it looks a little more dramatic. I think that works pretty well, but you don't always have to do these little effects that I add to my pieces. I think they help the piece, but sometimes if you do too many effects, it gets a little out of control. Let's add some stars to the background using the pepper spray brush. I'm going to start with a feature of 1 and incrementally move it larger and larger to add more and more stars. Let's go ahead and blur those stars with effects soften. And we don't want to blur them too much, but we do need to blur them a little bit. If the moon is blurred, the background needs to be blurred as well. So just try to get it to kind of balance out visually there. I think that setting looks pretty good. And let's go ahead and create a new layer and use the glow brush to enhance just a few of those stars to make them glow. Those will be maybe some planets or bigger stars, closer stars. Let's use that same glow brush on a new layer set to screen, and let's glow the edge of the moon where it's facing the light as well. And let's add a little bit of color on a new layer to the background just to kind of make it less black and a little more flavored. I use some blue and purple and green. Go ahead and save a copy of your artwork and then flatten all of your layers. And now we can go ahead and add a layer on top for some dark blue shading on a multiply layer. We'll add a little bit of orange on the brighter side, and that just gives it a nice kind of color shift where it's lighter on one side and darker on the other. And if you reduce the layer opacity until you get a subtle blend, you'll have something that looks like a pretty cool moon. Now, this isn't an exact replica of our moon, it's just kind of a fantasy moon. But if you wanted to, you could try to match it a little better to how our moon looks by placing the spots where they should be. And you can also use different kinds of colors and textures and really make your own moons and planets with this technique. If you enjoyed this episode of Draw This, take a quick second to like this video and share it with your friends. And if you're new to my channel, don't forget to click the subscribe button to get free updates when I release new videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Tuesday.